The alley behind Turner's table smelled faintly of baked bread and car exhaust. The city's heartbeat. Its muted sirens. The hum of distant conversation. The occasional impatient horn throbbed just beyond the restaurant's walls. Marcus Turner stood there for a moment, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn jacket, watching the staff rush in and out through the heavy metal door. Their faces were focused but weary, their movements choreographed by habit. The signs of a dinner rush well underway. He had seen this scene countless times before. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, he wasn't the owner. For years, Marcus had prided himself on what Turner's table represented. More than a restaurant, it was a vision, a place where people from all walks of life could experience the warmth of good food and the dignity of excellent service. He had built it from nothing, brick by brick, menu by menu, yet now, standing in the shadows of his own creation, he felt like a stranger. The complaints had started trickling in months ago, whispered conversations from trusted staff. Emails from customers that began with, "I hate to bring this up," and ended with detailed accounts of poor treatment. Most of the grievances led back to one person, Carol Simmons. The manager. Carol had been with him for years, a constant fixture in the restaurant's success. Her charm and efficiency always on display during his visits. But lately, Marcus had begun to suspect that her outward professionalism was a veneer. One that cracked the moment he left the building. It was the accusations of discrimination that hurt the most. Turner's table had been a beacon for inclusivity in a city often divided by class and race. If those values were being undermined under Carol's watch, it wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was personal. He pulled the brim of his cap lower over his face and stepped inside. The air was a mix of heat and noise. The sharp clatter of pans meeting the hum of orders shouted over the line. Marcus slipped past the chaos, his eyes scanning the room. Carlos, the sous chef, spotted him first. "Mark, right?" Carlos wiped his hands on a grease-streaked apron and gave him a quick nod. "Dish pit's over there. Keep up, and we'll get along fine." "Got it," Marcus replied, his voice low and steady. The name, Mark, felt strange on his tongue. A mask he'd chosen for this mission. Tonight, he wasn't Marcus Turner, owner of one of the city's most celebrated restaurants. He was just a dishwasher, another cog in the machine. The dish pit was tucked into a corner, a world apart from the glamour of the dining room. Piles of plates, their edges streaked with remnants of sauce and crumbs, awaited his attention. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work, letting the rhythm of scrubbing and rinsing settle his nerves. He kept his head down, listening. Carol's voice carried across the kitchen like a whip crack, sharp and commanding. "Carlos, what's going on with table 6? That salmon's been sitting for too long." "It's on its way," Carlos called back, his tone measured, almost resigned. Marcus looked up just in time to see Carol stride into the kitchen. Her heels clicked against the tiles, each step a reminder of her authority. She was impeccably dressed, her sharp blazer untouched by the heat and chaos of the kitchen. The staff around her seemed to shrink as she moved, their casual banter evaporating into silence. She stopped abruptly, her gaze landing on Marcus. "And who's this?" she asked, her tone cool. "Assessing. New hire," Carlos replied without looking up. "Mark." Her eyes lingered on him, her lips curling into a faint, unimpressed smirk. "Well, Mark, keep up. We don't need another deadweight dragging this place down." Marcus nodded, saying nothing, his hands gripping the edge of the sink. He wasn't sure what he had expected from Carol, but it hadn't been this a curt dismissal, laced with a kind of disdain that felt too practiced. He turned back to his work, focusing on the soapy water and the steady rhythm of plates sliding into the rack. As the night wore on, Marcus observed, Carol moved through the kitchen with an air of authority that seemed to demand obedience rather than respect. Her critiques were swift, her tone biting. At one point, she cornered Sophia, a waitress balancing a tray of desserts. "Is this your idea of service?" Carol snapped, pointing at a slightly smudged plate. "Do you think our customers are paying top dollar to eat off dirty dishes?" Sophia's cheeks flushed, and she stammered an apology, her hands trembling as she wiped the plate clean. Carol didn't wait for a response before moving on. her heels clicking away. Marcus's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of the room shift with every sharp word Carol delivered. The staff moved faster, their movements more cautious, as if one misstep might draw her attention. It wasn't discipline. It was fear. By the end of the shift, Marcus's arms ached, but his mind raced. He stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, leaning against the wall as the city buzzed around him. Sophia joined him a moment later, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. "Does she always like this?" Marcus asked, his voice careful. Sophia glanced at him, her eyes tired but guarded. "You're new," she said simply. "You'll figure it out." He nodded, letting her words hang in the air. He had seen enough to know that the culture in his restaurant had shifted, that the values he had built it on were being eroded. But tonight was only the beginning. If Carol thought she could run this place unchecked, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The rhythm of the restaurant was a symphony of controlled chaos. The sizzling of pans, the clatter of plates, and the low hum of voices created an energy that might have been inspiring, even exhilarating, under different circumstances. But beneath the surface, there was an undertone of something else, a tension that rippled through the air. Subtle but undeniable. Marcus Turner, still cloaked in the anonymity of his Mark persona, worked silently at the dishwashing station. His hands moved through the soapy water with mechanical precision, but his mind was elsewhere, observing. Each interaction, each glance, each hushed word between staff painted a picture more vivid than any of the complaints he had read. He didn't need to press for information. The truth was woven into the fabric of every shift. It didn't take long for Marcus to notice patterns in Carol Simmons' behavior. Her presence was like a dark cloud, her sharp voice cutting through the kitchen with a weight that lingered long after she was gone. She had a way of commanding attention, but not through respect, through fear. "Raoul," Carol's voice snapped from across the room. She stood near the line where the seafood risotto was being prepared. Her gaze was fixed on Raoul, one of the cooks, as he carefully plated a dish. "Is that the jumbo shrimp I see?" Raoul froze, his hand hovering over the plate. "Yes, Miss Simmons, it's the special." "Not anymore," she interrupted, her tone curt. "We're using the smaller ones now. Cheaper, and the customers won't notice." "Swap it out." Raoul hesitated, glancing toward Carlos, the sous chef, who was busy at the grill. Carlos gave a barely perceptible nod, his jaw tight with frustration. Raoul sighed, reluctantly replacing the shrimp. Marcus said nothing, his hands still submerged in the steaming water. The moment passed quickly, but it left a bitter taste in the air. It wasn't just about the shrimp. It was about the message Carol sent with every decision. Cut corners, prioritize profits, and treat customers as if they wouldn't or shouldn't know better. Later, Marcus watched as Carol targeted Sophia again. The young waitress was carrying a tray of drinks when Carol stopped her in her tracks. "Sophia," Carol said, her voice low but sharp enough to turn heads. "If you can't keep your hands steady, maybe this isn't the job for you. Do you know how much those glasses cost if one of them breaks?" Sophia nodded quickly, murmuring an apology. Her face was pale, her hands trembling even more as she walked away. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Carol's words weren't just critiques. They were calculated to humiliate, to assert dominance. And it wasn't just Sophia. Over the course of the night, Marcus saw her zero in on others. Jorge, the dishwasher, for taking too long on his break. Raoul, again, for using too much sauce on a dish. And even Carlos, whose calm demeanor seemed to be the only thing keeping the kitchen from unraveling. But Carol's behavior wasn't limited to the staff. Marcus noticed how she interacted with customers, her tone shifting depending on who she was speaking to. She greeted wealthy patrons with warmth and deference, but her demeanor cooled when addressing anyone she deemed less important. A family of 4 seated near the kitchen received a curt nod and a dismissive wave when they politely requested a quieter table. By contrast, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit was treated to Carol's full charm, her voice dripping with politeness as she promised to personally oversee his meal. The disparity was clear, and it grated on Marcus in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had built Turner's Table to be a sanctuary from that kind of prejudice. A place where everyone felt welcome. Watching Carol erode that foundation, one interaction at a time, was like watching someone dismantle a house he had spent years building. At the end of the shift, Marcus stepped outside for another breath of cool air. Sophia was already there, leaning against the wall, her cigarette glowing faintly in the dim light. "Rough night?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone light. Sophia gave a bitter laugh. "Same as always. If you stick around long enough, you'll get used to it." "I don't think anyone should have to get used to that," Marcus said quietly. She glanced at him, her eyes tired but searching. "It's easy to say that when you have options," she replied. "For most of us, this is it. Carol knows that. She knows we can't afford to fight back." Marcus nodded, his heart heavy. "What about Carlos? He seems steady." Sophia exhaled a plume of smoke, her shoulders slumping. "Carlos tries, but there's only so much he can do. Carol's got the final say, and she makes sure everyone knows it." The door swung open, and Carlos stepped out, his apron slung over one shoulder. He joined them with a quiet nod, his expression grim. "Mark," Carlos said, addressing Marcus for the first time outside the chaos of the kitchen. "How's your first week?" "Eye-opening," Marcus replied. Carlos gave a wry smile. "Yeah, it's a lot. You're lucky, though. You're new. You can leave whenever you want." Sophia scoffed. "He's not wrong. Most of us are stuck here." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling around them. Marcus looked at Sophia, at Carlos, at the door that led back into the restaurant. He could feel the exhaustion in their voices, the resignation in their stances. But he also saw something else, something he hadn't expected. Despite everything, they cared. They cared about the restaurant, about their coworkers, about the customers who walked through those doors. That care, buried beneath layers of frustration and fatigue, was the thread that held everything together. As Marcus walked home that night, his thoughts were heavy. Carol's behavior wasn't just a problem. It was a symptom of something deeper. A culture of fear and neglect that had taken root under her leadership. But there was still hope. He had seen it in Carlos's quiet determination, in Sophia's resilience, in the way the staff supported each other even in the face of adversity. This wasn't just about firing Carol. It was about rebuilding what she had broken. It was about creating the kind of place Turner's Table was meant to be. And Marcus knew, with absolute certainty, that the real work was only beginning. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds as Marcus prepared himself for another day at Turner's Table. The city outside his apartment buzzed with life. But Marcus felt a quiet determination settle over him. The tension from the previous night still clung to him like a second skin. But it also steeled his resolve. What he had witnessed was unacceptable. But he knew that addressing it required patience. This wasn't just about calling Carol out. It was about understanding the depth of her impact and rebuilding the spirit of his restaurant. By the time he arrived at the restaurant, the atmosphere was already charged with anticipation for another busy evening. Staff moved around the kitchen with brisk efficiency, their voices low but hurried. Yet there was no escaping the subtle strain in their movements. The way their eyes darted toward the entrance whenever Carol's sharp heels echoed through the hallway. Marcus began his shift at the dish station, scrubbing pans and trays while quietly observing the dynamics of the kitchen. Today, Carol was in rare form. Her voice carried across the room, laced with irritation and authority. Every word seemed designed to remind everyone of her power. "Carlos," she snapped, holding up a plate that had just been sent out. "What's this? Too much garnish. We're not running a 5-star hotel." Carlos, as always, kept his composure. "That's the standard for that dish," he said evenly. "Well, the standard is costing us money," she retorted, slamming the plate onto the counter. "Cut it back. I don't want to see this again." Marcus noticed how Carlos's shoulders stiffened, the small tick in his jaw as he nodded. He didn't argue further, but the exchange lingered in the room, like a ripple spreading through water. The staff around him worked more cautiously, their movements deliberate and measured, as though trying to avoid drawing Carol's ire. As the hours wore on, Marcus saw the same pattern repeat itself. Carol criticized Raul for plating a dish too slowly, berated Jorge for stacking clean dishes unevenly, and dismissed a server's question about a special request with a wave of her hand. Each incident was small on its own, but together they created a picture of an environment where every moment felt like walking a tightrope. But it wasn't just Carol's behavior. It was the silence that surrounded it. The staff rarely spoke up, and when they did, it was with a hesitance that spoke volumes. Marcus could see the weight they carried, the quiet resignation in their eyes. They had learned that resistance only made things worse. And so they endured, hoping to make it through the day without being noticed. At one point, Marcus overheard a hushed conversation between two servers near the storage area. "I can't do this much longer," one of them whispered. "She's unbearable, and the customers are starting to notice." "Where are you gonna go?" the other replied, her voice tinged with defeat. "Nowhere's hiring, and at least here you know what to expect." The first server sighed. "Yeah, but at what cost?" The words struck a chord in Marcus. The cost of silence wasn't just emotional. It was professional, financial, and deeply personal. It wasn't just the staff who suffered under Carol's leadership. The restaurant itself was bearing the weight of her choices. Customers who once raved about their experiences at Turner's table were now leaving with lukewarm reviews. Their dissatisfaction whispered between bites of overpriced, underwhelming dishes. Later that evening, the situation reached a boiling point. A young black couple entered the restaurant, their smiles bright as they approached the hostess stand. Marcus, stationed near the kitchen, watched the interaction closely. The hostess greeted them politely. But when Carol appeared, her demeanor shifted. "Table for two?" the hostess asked. The couple nodded. "Yes. We have a reservation under Taylor." Carol stepped in, her smile thin but practiced. "Of course. Right this way." But instead of leading them to one of the elegant tables by the window, Carol directed them to a small table near the kitchen, a spot far removed from the ambiance of the main dining area. The couple exchanged a glance but didn't protest, their smiles fading as they followed her. As the night wore on, Marcus noticed how their service lagged. Their waiter seemed nervous, fumbling through their order, and when their food arrived, it was lukewarm and hastily plated. The woman politely flagged down the waiter, pointing out the issues, but before he could respond, Carol appeared at their table. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone cool. "Yes," the man said. "We've been waiting a long time, and the food isn't warm. We were hoping it could be reheated." Carol's smile tightened. "I'm sorry if the food isn't to your liking," she said, "but our kitchen is very busy tonight. Perhaps next time you could make an earlier reservation to ensure faster service." Marcus's chest tightened as he watched the couple exchange glances, their quiet dignity a stark contrast to Carol's dismissiveness. They didn't argue, but the disappointment on their faces was clear. They ate in silence, leaving most of their food untouched. By the time they left, Marcus felt a simmering anger he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the mistreatment. It was the normalization of it. The way Carol operated as though such behavior was justified, as though it would go unnoticed. That night, as Marcus walked home, he thought of all the ways silence could be a tool of oppression. Carol's power thrived on it. The staff's silence allowed her to continue unchecked, while the customer's silence allowed her to dismiss their experiences as insignificant. But Marcus knew he couldn't remain silent any longer. Change was coming, and it would start with him. The soft hum of morning traffic in Manhattan greeted Marcus as he sipped his coffee at the kitchen table. The muted gray light of dawn streamed through the window, casting long shadows on the polished surface of his counter. His thoughts swirled as he prepared himself for the day ahead. This wasn't just about addressing Carol. It was about addressing the culture she had allowed to fester under her leadership. Marcus understood the gravity of what lay ahead. The staff at Turner's table weren't just employees. They were individuals who had built their lives around the jobs they relied on. Many were immigrants or young professionals trying to get a foothold in the competitive restaurant industry. For some, this job was a lifeline. Marcus knew that if he mishandled this, the consequences wouldn't just be financial, they would be personal. When he arrived at the restaurant's headquarters, the atmosphere was calm and clinical, a stark contrast to the chaos of the kitchen. The conference room was spacious and filled with sunlight, its walls lined with framed photos of Turner's table's most celebrated moments. A packed dining room on opening night. Chefs in pristine whites showcasing signature dishes. Marcus himself shaking hands with prominent guests. Those photos represented everything he had built, a restaurant that stood as a beacon of inclusion and excellence. And yet, Marcus couldn't shake the image of Carol standing over Sophia, her tone dripping with disdain. He couldn't forget the couple seated by the kitchen door, their disappointment palpable as they endured the kind of treatment that went against everything Turner's table was meant to represent. A soft knock at the door pulled Marcus from his thoughts. His assistant, Renee, stepped inside. "She's here," Renee said, her voice professional yet warm. "Ready for this?" Marcus nodded. "Bring her in." Carol entered the room with her usual air of confidence, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She was dressed sharply, her blazer perfectly tailored, her makeup flawless. To anyone else, she might have seemed like a capable and commanding professional, but Marcus saw through the facade. "Good morning, Mr. Turner," Carol said with a polite smile as she extended her hand. Marcus shook it briefly, his expression unreadable. "Good morning, Carol, please, have a seat." As Carol settled into the chair opposite him, she placed her tablet on the table, ready for what she likely assumed was a standard performance review. Her posture was poised, her demeanor calm, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. She wasn't entirely sure why she'd been called in. "I wanted to speak with you about the state of the restaurant," Marcus began, his tone even. "There have been some concerning trends over the past few months. Staff turnover has increased, customer reviews have dipped, and I've received numerous complaints about the work environment." Carol's smile tightened, but she remained composed. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Turner. Running a restaurant of this scale requires tough decisions. Not everyone is cut out for the pressure. And, unfortunately, that can lead to dissatisfaction among staff. But I assure you, I've been doing everything in my power to maintain high standards." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "High standards?" he repeated. "I've been hearing about a culture of intimidation. About staff feeling disposable. About customers being treated differently based on their appearance." Carol's composure faltered for a fraction of a second before she quickly recovered. "I assure you, those claims are exaggerated. You know how rumors can spread in an environment like ours. I've always prioritized the success of the restaurant." Marcus nodded slowly, as though considering her words. Then, he said, "I'd like to talk about Mark." Carol blinked, confused. "Mark?" "Yes. The dishwasher you hired last week," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "The one you dismissed as insignificant. The one you condescended to and berated." Carol's confusion deepened. I don't recall anything specific about him. Dishwashers come and go. What does this have to do with?" Marcus cut her off, his voice sharper now. "Mark is me." The silence that followed was deafening. Carol's eyes widened as the realization sank in. Her confident posture stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "I've been working undercover at Turner's table," Marcus continued, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I wanted to see the day-to-day operations for myself, to understand what's really happening in the restaurant. And what I saw was unacceptable." Carol opened her mouth to speak, but Marcus didn't give her the chance. "I saw you berate staff who are overworked and underpaid. People who are just trying to make a living. I saw you target individuals based on their background and appearance, creating an environment of fear and resentment. And I saw you dismiss customers who didn't fit your idea of important." "Mr. Turner," Carol stammered, her voice shaking now. "If I had known." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus said, his tone cutting through her excuses. "You shouldn't need to know the owner is watching to treat people with basic decency. This isn't about one or two incidents. This is about a pattern of behavior that goes against everything this restaurant stands for." Carol's confidence crumbled as Marcus's words landed like hammer blows. She tried to interject, to defend herself, but each attempt was met with the quiet force of Marcus's conviction. "This restaurant was built on respect," Marcus said, his voice quieter now but no less powerful. "Respect for the staff, respect for the customers, and respect for the community it serves. You've betrayed that vision." The room fell silent again, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavy in the air. Carol's face was pale, her earlier bravado replaced by a mixture of shock and desperation. Finally, Marcus leaned back in his chair. Effective immediately. You are relieved of your duties. Security will escort you out. Carol stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice rising. I've dedicated years to this restaurant. You can't just. It's done, Marcus said, his tone final. Your behavior has left me no choice. Without another word, Carol stormed out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Marcus watched her go, feeling the tension in his chest begin to ease. This was only the beginning. Now came the harder part, rebuilding what Carol had broken. The restaurant felt quieter without Carol's presence. But the silence wasn't entirely comforting. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm. The aftermath, where everyone surveys the damage and wonders how to move forward. Marcus stood in the dining room early that morning, watching the sunlight creep across the polished floors. It was the same space he'd imagined years ago when he first dreamed of opening Turner's Table. A place that felt warm, welcoming, and alive with possibility. But now, it felt like a shell of what it had been. The staff had arrived earlier than usual, called in for a meeting they hadn't expected. They filed into the dining room cautiously, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Marcus could see it in their eyes. The fatigue, the doubt, the guarded hope that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Carlos was among the last to enter, his steps slow and measured. He hadn't spoken much since the news of Carol's dismissal, but Marcus could sense the weight he carried. As the sous chef, Carlos had been the de facto leader in the kitchen, shielding the team from Carol's worst tendencies as best he could. But even he couldn't erase the scars her management had left. Sophia, too, sat quietly near the back. She held her hands tightly in her lap, her eyes scanning the room nervously. Marcus thought back to their conversation in the alley, her bitterness barely masking the exhaustion she felt. These weren't just employees, they were people who had endured far more than they should have. And it was up to Marcus to make things right. When everyone had settled, Marcus stepped to the front of the room. The chatter died down instantly. All eyes on him. He took a deep breath before speaking, his tone calm but steady. Thank you all for being here, he began. I know the past few months have been challenging. You've worked under difficult circumstances, and many of you have faced treatment that no one should have to endure. I want to start by saying I'm sorry. The room was silent, but Marcus could feel the weight of his words sinking in. Some staff exchanged glances, their expressions softening ever so slightly. I trusted someone to lead this restaurant, Marcus continued, and that trust was misplaced. Carol's behavior was unacceptable, and it went against everything Turner's Table was meant to stand for. That's on me, and I take full responsibility. Sophia's hand tightened around her lap, her lips pressing together. Carlos nodded subtly, as if acknowledging a truth he'd long accepted but hadn't expected to hear spoken aloud. But this isn't just about acknowledging the past, Marcus said. It's about rebuilding the future, together. He glanced toward Carlos, who straightened in his chair, his brow furrowing in confusion. Carlos, Marcus said, his voice warm but firm. You've shown incredible dedication to this restaurant and to your team. You've led with quiet strength, even when the circumstances were far from ideal. Effective immediately. I'd like to promote you to general manager. The room was silent for a moment before a ripple of surprise spread through the staff. Carlos's eyes widened, and he shook his head slightly as if to say, Me? He stood slowly, his voice hesitant. Mr. Turner, I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept, Marcus replied with a small smile. You've earned it. Carlos's throat worked as he tried to find the words. Finally, he nodded. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. I know you won't, Marcus said, turning his gaze to Sophia. And Sophia, you've endured more than anyone should have to. You've shown resilience and strength in the face of challenges that would have broken most people. I'd like to promote you to assistant manager. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, you, Marcus said firmly. You have the heart for this role. And I trust you to help Carlos create a culture where everyone here feels valued. For a moment, Sophia seemed frozen, her emotions threatening to spill over. Then she nodded, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. I'll do my best." Marcus stepped back, his gaze sweeping across the room. These changes are just the beginning. Turner's Table was built to be more than just a restaurant. It's meant to be a place of community, of respect, of excellence. That's what we're going to rebuild, together. The staff began to murmur, their voices low but tinged with cautious optimism. Marcus could see the relief in their faces, the hope that had been buried starting to resurface. As the meeting ended and the staff dispersed, Marcus lingered in the dining room, watching as Carlos and Sophia were surrounded by their co-workers. Congratulations and encouragement flowing freely. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, a first step toward healing. When the last of the staff had left, Marcus stood alone, the dining room quiet once more. He thought of the customers who would walk through the doors that evening, unaware of the changes unfolding behind the scenes. They would come for the food, the atmosphere, the experience, and they would find it. But this time, it would be built on something real. Marcus exhaled deeply, a sense of resolve settling over him. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was clear. Turner's Table wasn't just a restaurant. It was a promise. And Marcus intended to keep it. The first week under Carlos and Sophia's leadership was filled with a sense of tentative hope. The toxic shadow Carol had cast over Turner's Table was beginning to lift. But the scars she left behind lingered. Marcus could see it in the way the staff hesitated before speaking up. The way they moved cautiously as though still waiting for reprimands that no longer came. It wasn't something that could be undone overnight. But he knew healing had to start somewhere. The dining room was unusually quiet that morning as Marcus arrived early for a planned staff training session. The chairs were neatly arranged around a long table, and the soft morning light streamed through the tall windows, reflecting off the polished wood. Marcus leaned against the doorway, observing as the staff began to trickle in. They looked curious, perhaps a little skeptical, but there was no mistaking the flicker of anticipation in their expressions. Carlos and Sophia were already there, setting up the coffee and pastries Marcus had insisted on providing. He noticed how easily they worked together, Carlos's steady presence grounding Sophia's vibrant energy. It was a partnership that balanced the room, and Marcus felt a small swell of pride at the decision he had made. The session began quietly, with Marcus standing at the front of the room, his hands resting on the back of a chair. He didn't use slides or a microphone, nor did he project the kind of corporate polish one might expect from an owner of his stature. Instead, his voice was calm, steady, and personal. "I want to thank all of you for being here," he began. "I know the past months have been difficult. You've dealt with a work environment that was, frankly, unacceptable, and I need you to know that I see that. I hear you, and I'm committed to making this a place where every single one of you feels respected and valued." A few heads nodded subtly, but most remained quiet, their eyes trained on Marcus. He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "Today, we're starting something new," he said. "This isn't just about fixing what was broken. It's about building something better, together." The training focused on inclusivity and respect. But it wasn't a lecture. Marcus led discussions about what the staff wanted Turner's Table to represent. About their experiences working under Carol's rule. And about the kind of workplace they hoped to create moving forward. At first, the responses were hesitant, murmured agreements and cautious observations. But as the hours passed, the room began to come alive with stories and ideas. Sophia shared her perspective as a server, describing the constant pressure she had felt to stay silent in the face of unfair treatment. Her voice wavered at first, but Carlos nodded encouragingly, and soon she was speaking with confidence. "I stayed because I didn't have another option," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "But now, I feel like we have a chance to change that. For everyone." One of the line cooks, Raul, raised his hand tentatively. "I just want to be able to take pride in my work again," he said. "Cooking is supposed to be about passion, but it's hard to feel that when you're just trying to survive the shift." Marcus nodded. "You're right, Raul, and part of my job is making sure you have the support and respect you need to bring that passion back." By the end of the session, The energy in the room had shifted. The staff began to speak more freely, exchanging ideas and stories with one another. There was laughter, nods of understanding, and even a few tears. It wasn't just a training session. It was the first step in mending the trust that had been fractured. When the meeting ended, Marcus lingered near the door, shaking hands with the staff as they filed out. Carlos and Sofia stayed behind, their expressions thoughtful but hopeful. That went better than I expected, Carlos admitted, leaning against the table. They're opening up. They needed this, Sofia added, her voice soft. We all did. Marcus smiled faintly. This is just the beginning, he said. The real work starts now. That evening, Marcus sat at his usual corner table, watching as the staff moved through the dining room with a renewed sense of purpose. There were still moments of hesitation, servers glancing nervously toward Carlos for reassurance, cooks double-checking plates before sending them out. But there was also laughter. The kind that had been missing for far too long. A family walked in, a black couple with their 2 young children, dressed for a special occasion. Marcus watched as Sofia greeted them warmly and led them to one of the best tables near the window. The children giggled as they climbed into their seats, their parents smiling softly as they took in the elegant surroundings. Sofia returned to the server station, where Carlos stood reviewing tickets. She leaned in, speaking quietly, but Marcus caught the words. That's the family who left early last month, she said. They're back. Carlos glanced toward the table, his brow furrowing briefly before he nodded. Let's make sure they get the service they deserve. Marcus felt a pang of guilt at the memory of how Carol had treated that family, seating them near the kitchen, delaying their orders, and serving them food that was barely warm. But now, the scene was different. The family laughed as the children played with their crayons, and their server, a young man named Eli, took their order with a genuine smile. When their food arrived, hot, fresh, and beautifully presented, the father raised his glass in a silent toast, his expression one of quiet contentment. Marcus exhaled, feeling a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying finally begin to lift. Later, as the family prepared to leave, Marcus approached their table. He introduced himself, offering a warm handshake and a quiet apology for their previous experience. We're working hard to make this a place where every guest feels welcome, he said. I hope you'll give us another chance. The father studied him for a moment, then smiled. Tonight was wonderful, he said simply. We'll be back. As they walked out, Marcus watched them go, the hum of the restaurant around him feeling lighter than it had in months. Change wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but it was possible, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt certain they were on the right path. It had been nearly 2 months since Carol's abrupt departure, and the transformation of Turner's table was visible in every corner of the restaurant. The once tense atmosphere had softened, replaced by a quiet hum of productivity and an underlying sense of purpose. For Marcus, the changes were promising, but he knew the work was far from over. That evening, the dining room was bustling. Warm light reflected off polished glassware, and the low murmur of conversation blended with the clinking of silverware. Marcus sat in his usual spot near the corner, observing the rhythm of the restaurant with a critical but hopeful eye. He sipped his coffee, the familiar bitterness grounding him as he watched the staff move with newfound confidence. Carlos emerged from the kitchen, his chef's whites pristine despite the busy dinner rush. He approached Marcus's table, carrying a plate of roasted lamb. Thought you might like to see tonight's special, Carlos said, setting the plate down with a small smile. Marcus leaned forward, inspecting the dish. The lamb was cooked to perfection, the sauce glistening under the dim lights. It looks incredible, Marcus said. How's the team holding up? Carlos sighed but nodded. Better. They're adjusting to the changes, and morale is definitely up. It's not perfect yet, but we're getting there. Marcus gave him an encouraging nod. That's all I can ask for. Progress, not perfection. As Carlos returned to the kitchen, Marcus's gaze drifted toward a table by the window. A young Latino couple sat there, their hands intertwined as they shared a quiet conversation. The server, Sofia, approached with a tray of desserts, her expression warm and genuine. Marcus couldn't help but feel a swell of pride watching her work. She had grown into her role as assistant manager with grace and determination, earning the respect of her peers and proving herself as a leader. But not everything was perfect. That much became clear when Marcus overheard a conversation at a nearby table. Two middle-aged diners, both impeccably dressed, spoke in hushed tones, though their words carried enough weight to reach his ears. "I don't know," the man said, glancing around the room. "The vibe here feels different now. Not quite the same as it used to be." His companion, a woman with an elegant scarf draped over her shoulders, nodded. "I noticed that too. It's like they're trying too hard to cater to a certain kind of crowd." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his face neutral. He understood what they meant, even if they didn't say it outright. The changes he had implemented promoting diverse leadership, fostering inclusivity, were noticeable. And not everyone welcomed them. The diner's comments weren't unique. Over the past weeks, Marcus had received subtle feedback from a handful of regular patrons, expressing vague dissatisfaction without pointing to anything concrete. It was always couched in polite terms. But the subtext was clear. Some people were uncomfortable with the shift in Turner's Table's culture. Still, Marcus refused to compromise his vision. The restaurant had to stand for something more than fine dining. It had to reflect the values he believed in: respect, equity, and a sense of belonging for all. As he mulled over these thoughts, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A woman in a simple floral dress stood hesitantly by the host's podium, her young son clutching her hand tightly. Sophia greeted them with her usual warmth, but the woman's nervousness was evident. "Hi," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have a reservation, but I was wondering if there's any chance we could get a table." Sophia glanced at the half-full dining room and smiled. "Of course. Let me find you a comfortable spot." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting toward a group of diners who were watching the exchange with thinly veiled judgment. Marcus could almost hear their thoughts. "She doesn't belong here." Sophia, unfazed, led the woman and her son to a cozy table near the center of the room, handing them menus with a reassuring smile. "Take your time. I'll be back to take your order in a moment." As the woman settled in, Marcus noticed her visibly relax. She glanced around the room, her son chattering excitedly about the menu. It was a small moment, but it struck Marcus deeply. This was exactly why he had made these changes. So that anyone, regardless of their background, could feel welcome at Turner's Table. The rest of the evening passed without incident. The dining room gradually emptied, the chatter giving way to the quiet clatter of dishes being cleared. Marcus stayed until the last table was served, watching as Sophia and Carlos coordinated the cleanup with their usual efficiency. When the restaurant finally closed, Marcus called a brief meeting in the dining room. The staff gathered, their expressions curious but attentive. Sophia stood beside Carlos, her arms crossed in a gesture of quiet confidence. "Thank you all for another great night," Marcus began, his voice steady. "I know the changes we've made haven't been easy, but I want you to know how proud I am of this team. You've not only adapted, you've thrived." A ripple of murmured appreciation moved through the group. But Marcus wasn't finished. "We're building something special here," he continued, "a place where everyone, staff and customers alike, feels valued. Not everyone will understand that. Some people might even push back against it. But that's okay. What matters is that we stay true to who we are." Sophia nodded subtly, and Carlos gave a quiet grunt of agreement. The staff seemed to take his words to heart, their postures relaxing slightly. After the meeting, as the staff filtered out, Marcus approached Sophia. "You handled that family beautifully tonight," he said. "Thank you." Sophia smiled, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "They deserved to feel welcome. That's what we're here for, right?" Marcus nodded. "Exactly." As he stepped outside into the cool night air, Marcus took a deep breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly. There would always be challenges, resistance, skepticism, even outright prejudice. But tonight, he felt a quiet confidence. Change wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And Turner's Table was proving that one small act of kindness, one decision rooted in integrity, could ripple outward, transforming not just a restaurant, but the people within it. The evening sun cast a golden glow over Manhattan as Marcus Turner stepped into Turner's table. The restaurant's familiar warmth enveloped him, the hum of conversation and the gentle clinking of silverware filling the air like a comforting melody. It had been 6 months since Carol's departure, and while the memories of her mismanagement still lingered, they felt like shadows fading into the past. In their place was something new, something Marcus had always envisioned but never fully seen until now. Carlos greeted him at the door, his chef's whites as crisp as his demeanor. "Good to see you, Mr. Turner," he said, extending a hand. "Just Marcus," he reminded him with a smile, shaking Carlos's hand firmly. "How's everything running tonight?" "Smooth as butter," Carlos replied, a flicker of pride in his voice. "We've got a full house, and the team is firing on all cylinders." Marcus followed him into the dining area, where every table was occupied. The air buzzed with a quiet vibrancy, laughter, murmured conversations, the occasional clink of a glass raised in celebration. It wasn't just busy, it was alive. The change was palpable, and Marcus could feel it in the way the staff moved, their steps purposeful but unhurried, their smiles genuine. Sophia was near the bar, assisting a new server with a wine pairing. Her presence was calm and steady, the kind of leadership that reassured rather than intimidated. She caught Marcus's eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they'd all taken to get here. Marcus found a seat near the corner window, where he could watch without being intrusive. From this vantage point, he observed the subtle but significant shifts that had taken place. The dining room was no longer a stage for power plays or fear-driven interactions. It was a space of mutual respect, where every customer was treated as a guest of honor, and every employee seemed to take pride in their work. A server approached with a glass of water and a warm smile. "Let me know if there's anything I can get for you, sir," she said. "Thank you," Marcus replied, watching her retreat with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had seen her grow from a shy new hire into a confident and capable member of the team. Moments like this reminded him why he had fought so hard to turn things around. As the evening progressed, Marcus noticed a young couple seated near the center of the room. They were dressed simply but elegantly, their faces lit with the kind of anticipation that suggested this was a special night. Sophia approached their table, her expression warm and welcoming. "Are we celebrating anything special tonight?" she asked, her voice kind. The man nodded, his hand brushing over the woman's. "Our anniversary," he said. "First one." Sophia beamed. "Congratulations. Let me bring out something special for you, on the house." The couple exchanged surprised smiles, their gratitude evident. Marcus watched as Sophia moved toward the kitchen, her steps light with purpose. Moments like these were small, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but they were the lifeblood of the restaurant's transformation. They spoke to a culture of care, one that Marcus had worked tirelessly to cultivate. Later that evening, after the last table had been cleared and the lights dimmed to a soft glow, Marcus gathered the staff for a brief meeting. The team stood around him in a semicircle, their faces a mix of fatigue and fulfillment. "I wanted to take a moment to thank you all," Marcus began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "This place isn't just a restaurant. It's a reflection of everyone who works here, everyone who walks through those doors. And tonight, I saw something extraordinary." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over them. "6 months ago, we were in a very different place," he continued. "Morale was low, trust was broken, and the culture here wasn't what it should have been. But tonight, I saw what this restaurant was always meant to be, a place of respect, warmth, and excellence." Sophia and Carlos stood side by side, their expressions quietly proud. Marcus turned to them. "Carlos, you've led this kitchen with integrity and skill, even when things were at their toughest. And Sophia, your compassion and leadership have set a tone that everyone here looks up to. The two of you have been instrumental in this transformation, and I can't thank you enough." The staff broke into applause, the sound echoing softly in the empty dining room. Carlos gave a modest nod, while Sophia's cheeks flushed with quiet gratitude. "But this isn't just about leadership," Marcus added, his gaze sweeping over the team. Every single one of you has played a part in this. From the servers to the kitchen staff to the dishwashers. You've all shown resilience and heart. And that's what makes Turner's Table special. Not the food, not the decor, but the people. After the meeting, as the staff began to trickle out for the night, Marcus lingered by the bar. Sophia approached him, a thoughtful look on her face. You've built something incredible here, she said, her voice soft. I'm honored to be part of it. Marcus shook his head gently. We built it, and it's just the beginning. She nodded, her expression resolute. Then let's keep building. When Marcus finally stepped outside into the cool night air, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. Turner's Table had always been more than a business to him. It was a vision, a commitment to something greater. And now, after months of struggle and growth, that vision was finally being realized. As he walked down the quiet streets of Manhattan, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of contentment. The work wasn't over. It never would be. But for the first time in a long while, he felt certain that they were on the right path. Turner's Table wasn't just a restaurant. It was a legacy, and Marcus knew that legacy would endure. Not because of him, but because of the people who had made it their own.